In this I cover slicers in pivot tables and dashboards. And slicers were introduced in Excel 2010, and it's really a type of a filter, but it's a very flexible and a nice type of a filter from a user standpoint. And they're also available in both the pivot tables and the dashboards. So here we're looking at a dashboard. This is the company sales analysis dashboard. Notice out to the right, I have these panels here, actually 5 different panels. One is for company, but I only happen to have one company in this database, so there's only a 1 showing up there. The rest of them have multiple fields to be able to choose from. And what the slicers will do is allow you to alter or filter the data that goes into, in this case, these graphs. On a pivot table, it would be the data that goes into the pivot table. And so if I want to, for instance, look at data for only a particular branch, then when I select the branch, watch the graphs, and you'll see what happens there. They'll adjust just for this one particular branch, Baltimore. Or I click Charleston, you see whichever branch I click on, the numbers are changing there on the graphs. Also, I select a specific salesperson in this slicer, and so now the graphs are reflecting just that one specific salesperson. Now, one thing that happens as I select a specific salesperson, for instance, Charles Hardy, if you look at the slicer, some of the fields kind of dim and appear at the bottom of the list. That's an automatic function of these slicers, is that when I choose something in one slicer that doesn't apply anymore in the other slicers, then they'll just drop to the bottom of the list and be gray, so they grayed out, so you wouldn't be able to select those. So in other words, Charles Hardy didn't have any sales out of these 4 branches at the bottom, and also didn't have any sales in 2010. Filters can also be applied to specific pivot tables or specific graphs. So if you notice here, when I click on a branch, all the graphs, all 3 of these graphs, react based on the branch that I'm clicking on. However, if I click a year, top 2 react to that, because someone was set to always show all the years of data that I have, and so I'm not narrowing down the years based on this slicer, but in the upper 2 cases I am, because I'm just looking at the current periods and current quarters of whatever years I have selected in this slicer. So it's possible, and we'll talk about in a few minutes how to do this, but it's possible to add a slicer and then have it selectively control certain graphs or pivot tables. To clear a slicer, you just click in the upper right-hand corner. And in this case, the fiscal invoice quarter slicer only controls this one graph, just showing whatever months in whatever quarter I happen to choose there. Slices can also be added, and you do this as a user of these pivot tables and dashboards. You can add slicers to them. To add a slicer, first of all, you just have to select one of the tables or one of the graphs, and you see here if I click on in the area of this graph, it shows up with a box around it, meaning that I have selected that graph. I could select this graph by clicking on it. So you choose whatever graph you want the slicer to apply to, first of all, and then go up here to the Pivot Chart Tools and select the Analyze tab, and then Insert Slicer off of that tab. Now what this does is it pops up a list of all of the fields that are in the SQL database behind this particular graph or pivot table. And I could choose any of these to be a slicer. If I wanted to look at sales by vendor, for instance, or in this case, gross profit percent by vendor, I could just click vendor name, and when I say OK, it's going to add that as a new slicer. And I drag this around and position it wherever I want on the screen, and then a list of all the vendors here, and I can choose, and you can see how this particular graph reacts now based on whatever vendor I happen to be choosing in this slicer. And when you add a slicer, there's a couple things to keep in mind. One is, and they're really on the right-click menu. If I right-click on the slicer, and sometimes to do it a couple times because the first time it thinks you want to move or copy the slicer, click on it a couple times there, and it'll bring up this selection menu here. And the first thing I always do is select the slicer settings at the bottom. And there's one box here, checkbox, that says Show Items Deleted from the Data Source. I uncheck that. And what happens here is when you add a slicer, it goes out and looks at the data in SQL, and it pulls in this case, all the vendor names that are in that SQL database at this time. It actually stores those in the slicer. And what happens is if I leave this checked, then the next time I refresh this data, even though possibly some of the vendors I no longer have in my data source, they'll still be in the slicer because I had this checked. I don't think that most people would want to see those. If they no longer exist in the data source, you wouldn't want to see them as choices in the slicer. So that's why I recommend unchecking this box. The other thing you can do that you may want to do sometimes, the caption comes in with just the sort of abbreviated field name from the database, and so you can go in here to this and you can change what the caption says on the slicer heading. So when I click OK, you'll see this caption here change to whatever I typed in there. Now it says vendor name. Those are a couple things you might want to change there. Now the other thing is, we talked about earlier how these slicers can control more than one graph or pivot table. In order to get it to do that, it's a right-click as well. And when you right-click here, there's an option called Pivot Table Connections. If I choose that option, then I see all of the pivot tables that actually are on this. And these graphs are actually controlled by pivot tables, so that's why it looks like a pivot table here. And you see the different sheet names. So in this case, this one is called the company sales and gross profit. That's this one right here. So if I want this vendor to apply to this, I'll check that box. And the other one says company quarter to date. That's this one here. This is showing, it's actually all the periods in the quarter. And so if I wanted to apply to that one, I'll check that one. And when it came in by default, it already had this one checked because that was the graph that I had selected when I added the slicer. So now that I've made that selection, you can see all the other two graphs also react now when I change the vendor on this slicer. Another thing you may want to do with these slicers sometimes is change the size of them just to position them better on the screen and in whatever room you have for them. And one thing you can very easily do is just grab it on a corner and grab it, drag it out and make it larger. You can grab in the middle and make it taller. Grab on the side and make it smaller or wider. So that's pretty easy to make those types of changes. But you can also, if you right-click, an option here for size and properties allows you to just put in a certain height and width. So if you want to have one that's a very specific size, you could key that size in, as opposed to having to drag it out and try to make it that size. You go position it in a certain spot on the screen just by entering that spot here, horizontal and vertical. This is the one thing that you may want to do. You may want to change the number of columns. So here I've got 3 columns instead of just 1. Change the button height and width as well if you want this to be different. So if I were to put this in 3 columns, maybe stretch it across here, maybe make it a little shorter but a lighter, just so it would fit in a certain spot easier, that type of thing. Then that's how you could alter the size and shape of a slicer. Also notice that all of those controls that we just looked at are on the top of the menu here in this section. The number of columns, height and width, and the height and width of the buttons. So all that appears right here as well. There are other options that you can choose. You can change the color scheme, so you can see that this below here is changing based on the slicer style that I've selected. And there are a lot of different styles that you can use. other thing about slicers is that they can also apply to pivot tables. So in this case, we actually already have 4 slicers in here. They all apply to this pivot table, so as I select them, they're changing the data in that pivot table. If I want to add a slicer to a pivot table, it's very similar to what I did with the graph earlier. I would have to position my cursor someplace in the pivot table itself. It can't be sitting out here to the side because I don't have the menu that I need. But as soon as I click in the pivot table, I have the pivot table tools menu. In this case, it would be options. On the graph, it was under the Analyze tab. Here on the pivot table, it's under the Options tab. So I would click Options and insert a slicer. And at that point, it's just the same as what I did before with the graph. Choose vendor name, for instance, click OK. It adds a slicer. I'd go here to Slicer Settings, uncheck this box, and now it's associated with this pivot table.